All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to put on our ancient historian hats and tackle a really fascinating question. How on earth do we judge if a book written thousands of years ago is reliable?
I mean, really think about it. How can we actually trust books written 2 millennia ago? When you read something by a famous historian like Caesar, how do you know what you're reading is what he actually wrote? It's a huge question.
Well, here's the first big hurdle, and it's a doozy. For pretty much every ancient book you can think of, the original manuscript, the one the author physically wrote, is gone. It's lost to history. All we have are copies of copies of copies, all written out by hand by scribes centuries later.
So, is it a lost cause? Do we just give up? Absolutely not. Historians actually have a really solid method for this. Think of it like a toolkit for doing textual detective work.
And it really comes down to two key things. First, the time gap. How many years passed between the original writing and the earliest copy we have today? Obviously, the shorter that gap, the better, right? Less time for mistakes to sneak in. Second, the number of copies. How many manuscripts actually survived? The more we have, the more we can compare them, spot errors, and get a much clearer picture of the original. Simple enough, shorter gap, more copies. That's the goal.
Okay, so to really get a feel for what good evidence looks like, we need something to compare it to. So let's use this toolkit on some of the most famous, trusted works of classical history. I'm talking about the bedrock of our understanding of the ancient world.
Just take a look at this chart for guys like Herodotus, Caesar, and other giants of history. The bar on the left is when they wrote their stuff. The bar on the right, that's our earliest copy. And you can see right away, those are some pretty big gaps. And get this. This quote from our source material is just staggering. Tacitus is one of our main sources on the Roman Empire, and yet for some of his major works, everything we know depends on just 2 manuscripts that happen to survive. 2!
Let's zero in on a really famous one. Julius Caesar's Gallic War. He wrote it around 50 BC. But you know when our earliest solid copy is from? Around 900 AD. That's a gap of almost 1,000 years. A whole millennium of scribes copying copies before we get the text we have today.
And the number of copies we have from that period? 9. Just 9. Everything we know about those famous campaigns, every translation you can buy, it all hangs on just 9 medieval manuscripts.
And Caesar isn't some weird exception. Look at this. Thucydides, Herodotus, Tacitus. It's the same story. Huge time gaps and a tiny handful of copies. And you know what? In the world of classical history, this is considered good, solid evidence. This is the standard.
Okay, so now that we've established that baseline, let's take the very same historian's toolkit, time gap and number of copies, and apply it to another very famous set of ancient writings, the New Testament. Now, looking at the same kind of chart, you can probably see the difference right away. The gap between the original writing and our earliest big copies is, well, it's a whole lot shorter.
How much shorter? Well, for the big, important collections, the codices they're called, we're talking about a time gap of about 300 years. So instead of 1,000 years like with Caesar, we're down to just a few centuries. That's a huge difference.
But here is the number that just blows everything else out of the water. When we ask how many manuscript copies we have, it's not 2, it's not 9, it's over 20,000. Over 20,000 handwritten copies and fragments in Greek and other ancient languages.
So, the real kicker is what happens when you put these 2 sets of data right next to each other. Let's just forget about belief for theology for a second. Let's just look at this purely as a historian examining the raw data. Look at the time gap. Caesar's nearly 1,000-year gap on the left, the New Testament's 300-year gap on the right. The difference is just visually obvious. We are so much closer in time to the original New Testament documents than we are for almost any other classical author.
And then you get to this slide, and it's not even a fair fight. 9 copies for Caesar versus more than 20,000 for the New Testament. I mean, the bar for the New Testament would go through the roof. This sheer amount of data for scholars to work with is just on another planet.
So what does all this mean? Well, if we're judging purely by the manuscript evidence, using the exact same 2 rules that every historian uses, the conclusion is kind of inescapable. The New Testament is backed up by evidence that is orders of magnitude better than any other book from the ancient world. Period.
And that leaves us with a really interesting question to chew on. If historians are perfectly comfortable accepting Caesar's history based on 9 copies from 1,000 years later, what should we make of a text that has tens of thousands of copies from a much, much earlier date? It definitely makes you think, doesn't it?